The Frozen Fish Alibi. Welcome, dear listeners, to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your narrator for tonight's tale of mystery and deception. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. Have you ever noticed how the most ordinary places can harbour the darkest secrets? Perhaps a local shop you pass every day, never suspecting what lies beneath its mundane facade. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Now, settle in with your favourite warm beverage as we journey to the village of Little Bentham, where Miss Jane Marple is about to encounter a most peculiar death. Chapter 1. A Cold Morning at Whitmore's Fishmonger's. The February morning arrived with a bitter frost that painted Little Bentham's windows with delicate crystal patterns. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest coat, made her way along the high street with careful steps, mindful of the treacherous ice that had formed overnight. She had risen early, as was her custom, intending to purchase fresh sole from Whitmore's fishmongers before the best selections were claimed by other discerning customers. The shop stood at the corner of Market Street, its blue and white striped awning crisp with frozen moisture. Miss Marple had patronised Whitmore's for nearly 2 decades, appreciating Mr. Albert Whitmore's dedication to quality and his unfailing courtesy toward his elderly customers. It was therefore with some surprise that she found the shop's door still locked at 8:30, a full 30 minutes after its customary opening time. Young Tommy Perkins, the delivery boy from the bakery next door, was peering through the shop window with obvious concern. "Morning, Miss Marple," he called out, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Mr. Whitmore's never late opening. Been standing here 10 minutes already, and Mrs. Henderson's waiting too. She needs her kippers for her husband's breakfast." Mrs. Henderson, a stout woman in a green wool coat, stood nearby with an expression of mounting irritation. "Most irregular," she declared. "Albert Whitmore hasn't missed an opening in 15 years, not even when he had that terrible bout of influenza last winter." Miss Marple approached the shop window, noting that the interior lights were off, though a faint glow emanated from beneath the door leading to the storage areas at the rear of the premises. "Has anyone tried telephoning?" she inquired gently. "Lines are down from the frost," Tommy replied. "Half the village lost service overnight." It was then that James Fletcher, Mr. Whitmore's business partner, arrived in his motor car, pulling up to the curb with evident haste. A thin man of approximately 40 years, with nervous hands that constantly adjusted his spectacles, Fletcher had joined the business 18 months prior, bringing much-needed capital and modern accounting methods to the traditional establishment. "What's all this, then?" Fletcher demanded, producing a ring of keys from his coat pocket. "Albert should have opened ages ago." His face bore an expression of genuine puzzlement as he unlocked the shop door, the bell above it chiming weakly in the cold air. The interior of the shop was dark and unusually quiet, lacking the familiar hum of refrigeration units and the subtle smell of fresh fish that normally permeated the space. Fletcher flicked the light switches, but nothing happened. "Power must be out," he muttered, moving toward the rear of the shop. "The backup generator should have kicked in for the cold storage." Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her instincts alert to something beyond mere mechanical failure. The shop's display cases stood empty, awaiting the day's arrangements of cod, haddock and shellfish that would normally have been prepared by this hour. Fletcher pushed through the heavy plastic strips that separated the shop from the preparation area, then stopped so abruptly that Miss Marple nearly collided with him. "Oh, good God," he breathed, his face draining of colour. The entrance to the main cold storage room stood before them, its massive steel door sealed shut. Through the small window set at eye level, they could see Albert Whitmore's still form sprawled on the frost-covered floor, his face blue with cold, his eyes open and staring at nothing. Fletcher fumbled with the door's release mechanism, his hands shaking visibly. "It's locked from the inside," he said, his voice rising with panic. "The emergency release. It's been activated from within. He must have gotten trapped and... Miss Marple studied the door mechanism with careful attention, noting the position of the internal lock and the unusual accumulation of frost around its edges. "Most peculiar," she murmured, though her observation was lost in the commotion as Fletcher finally managed to force the door open. The Arctic air that rushed out caused them both to step back momentarily. When they entered, the full tragedy of the scene became apparent. Albert Whitmore had been dead for several hours, his body rigid with both rigor mortis and the terrible cold of his final prison. Chapter 2. Inspector Craddock arrives with questions. The arrival of Inspector Craddock brought welcome order to the chaos that had erupted following the discovery of Albert Whitmore's body. A tall, methodical man with prematurely grey hair, Craddock had worked with Miss Marple on previous occasions and had learned to value her observations. Though he maintained proper police protocol in his investigations, the cold storage room had been sealed off, yellow tape creating a barrier that transformed the familiar fishmonger's shop into something altogether more sinister. Miss Marple had positioned herself in the preparation area where she could observe the proceedings while remaining unobtrusive, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the peculiar scene. "Death by hypothermia," Dr. Haydock announced after his preliminary examination. "The poor fellow's been dead since sometime between midnight and 3 this morning. The extreme cold makes it difficult to be more precise." Inspector Craddock consulted his notebook, his expression thoughtful. "The door locks from the inside as a safety feature, but there's an emergency release mechanism on the interior. Why didn't Whitmore use it?" Fletcher, who'd been providing tea to the assembled police officers from the shop's small kitchen, looked increasingly distressed. "The mechanism is clearly marked with luminous paint. Even in complete darkness, Albert would have been able to see it. We had it installed just 6 months ago, after new safety regulations came into effect." "Perhaps he panicked," suggested Sergeant Pine, a young officer with an eager disposition. "Disorientation from the cold, fumbling in the dark. It's happened before in similar circumstances." Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "If I might make an observation," she said, causing all heads to turn toward her. "The frost patterns on the shelving units are rather interesting." Craddock moved closer, following her gaze toward the metal shelves that lined the storage room walls. Each shelf held boxes of frozen fish, arranged by species and date of delivery, according to the labels clearly visible on their sides. "What about them, Miss Marple?" the inspector asked, having learned to trust her eye for seemingly insignificant details. "Well," she continued, approaching the nearest shelf, "observe how the frost has accumulated on most of the boxes. It's uniform, suggesting they've been undisturbed for several days. But here," she indicated a section near the back wall, "and here the frost patterns are quite different. These boxes have been moved recently, perhaps within the last 12 hours. Craddock examined the indicated areas with growing interest. The frost on several boxes showed clear evidence of disturbance, with finger marks visible in the crystalline coating and gaps in the accumulation that suggested recent handling. "Fletcher," the inspector called, "what would Whitmore have been doing in here at midnight? Surely all preparation work is done during business hours." Fletcher appeared genuinely puzzled. "There's no reason for anyone to be in cold storage after closing. We prepare the displays first thing in the morning, and deliveries come before noon. Albert was meticulous about his routines." Miss Marple had moved deeper into the storage room. Careful not to disturb potential evidence, her attention focused on a particular section of shelving against the far wall. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe you should examine this area." Behind a row of boxes labelled Premium Salmon January Stock, there appeared to be an irregularity in the wall itself. What should have been smooth insulation showed signs of repeated contact, with scuff marks and small tears in the protective coating. Sergeant Pine carefully removed the boxes under Craddock's supervision, revealing what appeared to be a concealed panel, roughly 2 feet square, set into the insulated wall. The panel had been painted to match its surroundings, but was clearly a later addition to the room's original construction. "What the devil?" Fletcher exclaimed, moving forward before being stopped by Pine's outstretched arm. "That wasn't there when we renovated. I supervised the work myself." Craddock produced a pair of latex gloves and carefully worked the panel free. Behind it lay a cavity containing several wrapped packages, each roughly the size of a shoebox. The brown paper wrapping bore no identifying marks, but the weight and shape suggested something far more valuable than frozen fish. "Mr. Fletcher," Craddock said, his tone now official and cold, "I think you'd better explain what your partner was really storing in this facility." Fletcher's face had gone pale, his usual nervous energy replaced by something approaching shock. "I have no idea, Inspector. I can't believe Albert would... We're fishmongers, for heaven's sake. We sell cod and haddock, not whatever that is." Miss Marple observed Fletcher's reaction with careful attention. His surprise appeared genuine, Yet she had learned through long experience that the most accomplished deceivers often possessed the ability to project convincing innocence when circumstances required it. "We'll need to examine the shop's records," Craddock announced. "Financial statements, delivery logs, anything that might explain what Mr. Whitmore was really doing here." As the packages were carefully photographed and tagged for evidence, Miss Marple noticed something else that troubled her. Near the concealed panel, partially hidden beneath a layer of frost, lay a single fish scale. But it was not from any common market fish. The iridescent quality and unusual size suggested something altogether more exotic, the kind of species that would never normally pass through a village fishmonger's shop. Chapter 3. The Ledger with 2 sets of books. The shop's small office, located above the main retail space, revealed itself to be a study in contrasts. One side, clearly Albert Whitmore's domain, displayed the orderly chaos of a traditional businessman, with invoices sorted into wooden trays and delivery schedules pinned to a corkboard with military precision. The other side, Fletcher's territory, featured modern filing cabinets and a calculating machine that looked quite out of place among the Victorian furnishings. Inspector Craddock had commandeered the space for his investigation, spreading various documents across the worn oak desk, while Sergeant Pine catalogued evidence from the cold storage room below. Miss Marple had been permitted to remain, her local knowledge and previous assistance having earned her a measure of unofficial involvement in the proceedings. "These books are remarkably thorough," Craddock observed, examining a leather-bound ledger that documented the shop's daily transactions. "Every purchase, every sale, every supplier payment accounted for in Whitmore's own hand." Fletcher hovered near the door, wringing his hands with increasing agitation. Albert was meticulous about record-keeping. He insisted on maintaining the handwritten ledgers even after I introduced modern accounting methods. Said he didn't trust machines with something as important as the shop's finances. Miss Marple, seated in a worn armchair near the window, studied Fletcher's nervous manner with quiet interest. "Mr. Fletcher," she said gently, "you mentioned you brought capital to the business when you became partner. Might one ask what prompted Mr. Whitmore to seek a partner after running the shop independently for so many years?" Fletcher adjusted his spectacles, a gesture Miss Marple had noticed he repeated whenever faced with uncomfortable questions. The business needed modernization, new refrigeration units, updated display cases, compliance with health regulations. Albert had the expertise and reputation, but lacked the funds for necessary improvements. "And these improvements have been successful?" Craddock inquired, not looking up from his examination of the books. "Very much so. Revenue increased by 30% in the first year alone. We expanded our supplier network, introduced special orders for restaurants, even started providing fish for several hotels in the neighbouring villages." It was then that Sergeant Pine entered, carrying a second ledger he'd discovered hidden behind the filing cabinet. This volume, bound in black leather rather than the brown of the official books, bore no identifying marks on its cover. "Found this wrapped in oilcloth, sir," Pine reported. "Seems Mr. Whitmore kept more than one set of books." The revelation caused Fletcher to sink into the nearest chair, his face ashen. "That's impossible. I handled all the financial records. If Albert was maintaining separate books, I would have known." Craddock opened the black ledger carefully, revealing pages of entries in Whitmore's characteristic copperplate handwriting. But these were no ordinary business transactions. The entries used a code system, with dates, amounts, and what appeared to be client references indicated by initials and numbers rather than names. "February the 2nd, RC, Package 7, £500, Craddock read aloud. "February 9th, MP, Special Delivery, 750s. These amounts are far beyond what one would expect from selling fish." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Inspector, might I see the dates of those entries?" Craddock showed her the relevant pages, and she nodded thoughtfully. "How interesting. These dates correspond with the shop's busiest delivery days, when multiple suppliers would be coming and going, rather convenient for moving packages without attracting attention." Fletcher had recovered somewhat from his initial shock and was now examining the ledger with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "This explains the discrepancies I'd noticed in our inventory. I thought we were experiencing unusual spoilage rates, but Albert always had explanations. Said it was due to power fluctuations affecting the refrigeration." "You suspected nothing more serious?" Craddock pressed. "How could I? Albert Whitmore was a pillar of the community. He served on the church council, contributed to local charities. The idea that he was involved in smuggling, I presume that's what we're discussing, it's incomprehensible. Miss Marple's attention had been drawn to a particular series of entries near the end of the ledger. The amounts had increased significantly in recent weeks, and besides several entries, Whitmore had added cryptic notations. JF knows appeared 3 times, each instance followed by a question mark. "Mr. Fletcher," she said quietly, "your initials are James Fletcher, are they not?" Fletcher nodded, then seemed to realize the implication. "You can't seriously suggest that Albert thought I was aware of his activities?" "The evidence suggests he was becoming concerned about discovery," Craddock observed. "These notations appear to indicate growing paranoia about your knowledge of his side business." The inspector's attention was then drawn to the final entry, dated the previous evening. "Final collection arranged. JF problem must be resolved." The implications of this entry cast a new complexion on the morning's discoveries. If Whitmore had been planning to resolve the Fletcher problem, it suggested a level of desperation that might have led to dangerous confrontations. "Inspector," Miss Marple interjected, "have you noticed that several pages have been removed from this ledger? The binding shows clear evidence of extraction, and the page numbers skip from 47 to 52. Craddock examined the binding carefully, confirming her observation. "Recently removed, by the look of it. The tear marks are fresh." Fletcher had grown increasingly agitated during this exchange. "This is madness. Yesterday was completely normal. Albert and I reviewed the week's orders, discussed the Valentine's Day special offerings. He seemed perhaps a bit distracted, but nothing suggested he was planning any sort of resolution regarding me." "Where were you last night, Mr. Fletcher?" Craddock asked formally. "At home with my wife. We had dinner, listened to the wireless, retired at 10 o'clock. My wife can confirm this." As the investigation continued, Miss Marple found herself studying the pattern of evidence with growing interest. The hidden ledger, the removed pages, the coded entries, all suggested a carefully orchestrated deception that had operated successfully for months. Yet something had changed recently, something that had led to Albert Whitmore's death in his own cold storage room. The question that troubled her most was whether Whitmore had been the victim of his own criminal enterprise, or whether someone else had discovered his secret and decided to take fatal action. Chapter 4. A Visitor's Midnight Footprints. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Little Bentham's High Street as Miss Marple made her way back toward Whitmore's fishmonger's. She had spent the intervening hours at home, ostensibly tending to her garden's winter vegetables, but in reality turning over the peculiar circumstances of Albert Whitmore's death in her mind. The shop remained closed, police tape creating a barrier that had drawn curious villagers throughout the day. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Pemberton and Miss Weatherby engaged in animated discussion near the bakery, their expressions mixing shock with the unmistakable satisfaction of possessing extraordinary gossip. Constable Rivers, stationed at the shop's entrance, touched his helmet respectfully as Miss Marple approached. "Inspector Craddock asked me to watch for you, Miss Marple. Said you might return with additional observations." Inside, she found Craddock in the preparation area, examining the floor with particular attention. The concrete surface, normally scrubbed clean daily, had revealed unexpected evidence under careful scrutiny. "Miss Marple," Craddock greeted her, "your timing is excellent. We've discovered something rather interesting." Near the entrance to the cold storage room, barely visible against the grey concrete, were several partial footprints outlined in a fine, silvery powder. The prints showed a distinctive tread pattern with what appeared to be unusual wear on the left heel. "Fish scales," Craddock explained, noting her interest, ground to an almost powder-fine consistency. "Sergeant Pine noticed them when the afternoon light hit at just the right angle. Someone tracked them from the storage room, but they're not from any fish we found in inventory." Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the prints, producing her small magnifying glass. "How curious. These scales have an iridescent quality quite unlike our common market fish, rather more like tropical or exotic species." Fletcher, who had been permitted to return to collect essential business documents, overheard this exchange. "We don't stock exotic fish. Too expensive for village trade, and they require special handling permits." "Yet someone brought such fish here," Craddock observed. The question is when and why. Miss Marple rose carefully, her attention drawn to the doorframe of the cold storage room. "Inspector, have you examined these scratch marks?" Fresh gouges marred the metal frame at approximately shoulder height, as though someone had gripped it forcefully while struggling. The marks were recent, the exposed metal still bright beneath the surface coating. "We noticed them," Craddock confirmed. "They suggest a struggle, though Whitmore's body showed no obvious signs of violence beyond the effects of hypothermia." "No obvious signs," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, "but hypothermia itself can mask certain symptoms. Dr. Haydock might find something more upon closer examination." Her attention was then drawn to a small detail that others had overlooked. A single thread caught on a rough edge of the doorframe, nearly invisible against the metallic surface. The thread was dark blue of good quality wool, the sort used in expensive winter coats. "Mr. Fletcher," she inquired, "what colour coat does your wife wear?" Fletcher looked puzzled by the seemingly irrelevant question. "Green, typically. Why do you ask?" Before Miss Marple could respond, Sergeant Pine entered with news that would shift the investigation's focus entirely. "Inspector, we've had a response from London about those packages. The wrapping paper had fingerprints, but not Whitmore's." The room fell silent as the implications registered. If Whitmore hadn't handled the packages, it suggested either an accomplice or that someone else entirely had planted them in the cold storage room. "Whose prints?" Craddock demanded. "Unknown to our records, sir, but there's something else. The packages contained rare tropical fish preserved in special solution, extremely valuable to collectors and definitely smuggled. The species are protected, import strictly forbidden." Fletcher sank into a nearby chair. "Tropical fish? But that makes no sense. Albert had no interest in exotic species. He was a traditional fishmonger, proud of serving proper British fish." Miss Marple had moved to examine the shop's delivery log, which lay open on the preparation counter. According to this, there was an unscheduled delivery last night at 11:30. The entry is in Mr. Whitmore's hand, but it's quite shaky, as though written in haste or distress. Craddock studied the entry. It simply read, "Special delivery received, payment pending." "No supplier name, no invoice number," the inspector noted, completely unlike Whitmore's usual meticulous records. The investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who had completed his detailed examination of the body. His expression was grim as he pulled Craddock aside for a private word, though Miss Marple's keen hearing caught fragments of their conversation. Not just hypothermia, signs of a struggle, possible head trauma. When Craddock returned, his face bore the expression of a man whose suspicions had been confirmed. Dr. Haydock found evidence of a blow to the back of Whitmore's head, not fatal in itself, but enough to render him unconscious. Someone put him in that cold storage room knowing he wouldn't be able to escape. The shop's atmosphere seemed to grow colder, despite the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. What had initially appeared to be a tragic accident had transformed into deliberate murder. Fletcher had gone very pale. "You're saying someone killed Albert? But who? And why?" Miss Marple's gaze had returned to the mysterious footprints in the fish-scale dust. "I believe," she said quietly, "we need to discover who visited Mr. Whitmore last night. Someone who deals in exotic fish, someone who knew about the concealed panel in the cold storage room, and someone who had reason to want Albert Whitmore permanently silenced." As she spoke, she noticed Fletcher unconsciously touching his left shoe, where the heel showed distinctive wear patterns. It was a small gesture, likely meaningless, but Miss Marple filed it away with all the other small details that would eventually form a complete picture of the truth. Chapter 5. Mrs. Fletcher's Nervous Confession. The Fletcher residence stood on Elm Grove, a respectable street of Victorian houses that had once housed the village's prosperous merchants. Miss Marple arrived with Inspector Craddock just as the evening shadows were lengthening, having suggested that Mrs. Fletcher might provide valuable insight into her husband's business relationship with the late Mr. Whitmore. Constance Fletcher answered the door herself, a handsome woman in her early 40s with carefully styled auburn hair and nervous eyes that darted between her visitors. She wore a house dress of expensive material, though Miss Marple noticed it bore signs of hasty pressing, as though she'd been interrupted in household tasks. "Inspector Craddock," Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "James telephoned to say you might call. Please, come in." The sitting room reflected middle-class prosperity with its matched furniture and watercolour paintings of local scenes. Yet Miss Marple's experienced eye detected signs of financial strain, worn patches in the carpet carefully hidden by strategic furniture placement, curtains that had been turned to hide sun fading, small economies that suggested money troubles. "Mrs. Fletcher," Craddock began formally, "we need to verify your husband's whereabouts last evening." "He was here," she replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "We had shepherd's pie for dinner, listened to the concert programme on the wireless, then retired at 10 o'clock. Miss Marple had positioned herself where she could observe both Mrs. Fletcher's face and the room's details. A man's coat hung on the rack near the door, dark blue wool of good quality. More interesting still was the pair of boots beneath it, the left heel showing distinctive wear. "Did your husband go out at all during the evening?" Craddock pressed. Mrs. Fletcher's composure cracked slightly. "Well, he did step out briefly around 11, said he needed to check something at the shop, but he was only gone for 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour." This admission changed everything. Fletcher had claimed to be home all evening, yet his wife now revealed he'd been out during the critical time period. "Mrs. Fletcher," Miss Marple interjected gently, "that's a lovely coat on the rack. Is it your husband's?" "Yes, his winter coat. Why do you ask?" Before Miss Marple could respond, Craddock had moved to examine the coat, finding fish scales in the pockets and a tear in the hem that matched the thread found at the crime scene. Mrs. Fletcher sank into a chair, her facade of calm finally crumbling. "Oh God, you don't think James... He couldn't have... Albert was his partner." "Partners sometimes have disagreements," Craddock observed. "Was your husband having difficulties with Mr. Whitmore?" The woman's silence stretched uncomfortably before she finally spoke. "James discovered something. About 2 weeks ago he found discrepancies in the inventory that didn't match the books. He confronted Albert, who became quite agitated, said James was imagining things." "But your husband persisted," Miss Marple prompted. "He's always been meticulous about numbers. It's why Albert needed him as a partner, to modernize the business practices. But recently, James said Albert seemed different, secretive. He'd make excuses to handle certain deliveries alone, wouldn't let James near the cold storage during specific times." Mrs. Fletcher rose abruptly and moved to a writing desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she produced a small notebook. "James has been keeping his own records, documenting the irregularities. He was planning to confront Albert again, with proof this time." Craddock examined the notebook, which contained detailed observations of suspicious activities, unexplained visitors, and inventory discrepancies dating back 3 months. "Your husband suspected smuggling?" the inspector asked. "He thought Albert might be selling fish off the books to avoid taxes. James never imagined anything more serious." She paused, wringing her hands. "When he came home last night, he was terribly upset. Said he'd had an argument with Albert, that things had gotten out of hand." Miss Marple and Craddock exchanged glances. This was approaching a confession by proxy. "Mrs. Fletcher," Miss Marple said kindly, "what exactly did your husband tell you about last night?" The woman began to weep quietly. "He said he'd gone to confront Albert with evidence. Found him in the shop with packages that clearly weren't fish. They argued. Albert threatened him, said James didn't understand the situation, that dangerous people were involved." "And then?" Craddock pressed. "James said Albert tried to attack him with a scaling knife. They struggled. James pushed him away and Albert fell, hit his head on the corner of the preparation table. When James tried to help him, Albert was unconscious." The room fell silent except for Mrs. Fletcher's quiet sobs. The confession, delivered second-hand, painted a picture of manslaughter rather than murder, yet crucial details remained unexplained. "If this was an accident," Craddock said carefully, "why didn't your husband call for help? Why put Whitmore in the cold storage?" Mrs. Fletcher shook her head desperately. "He didn't. James left Albert in the preparation area and came straight home. He was going to call Dr. Haydock, but then realized how it would look, him being there after hours, the evidence of smuggling. He thought Albert would recover, that they could sort it out in the morning." Miss Marple had been studying Mrs. Fletcher's shoes, visible beneath her skirt hem. They bore traces of fish scales, and the sole pattern was distinctive. "Mrs. Fletcher, did you perhaps go to the shop yourself last night, after your husband returned?" The woman's tears stopped abruptly, her face draining of colour. "How did you—" "You went to check on Mr. Whitmore," Miss Marple continued gently. "You found him beginning to recover consciousness. What happened then?" Mrs. Fletcher's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He was getting up, said he was going to call the police, have James arrested. He knew about James's debts, you see. The gambling debts from before we married. Albert said he'd make sure James went to prison, that we'd lose everything. The truth was emerging now, terrible and inevitable. I didn't mean to, Mrs. Fletcher continued. I just wanted him to listen, to understand. But he kept threatening, saying awful things. I pushed him, just to make him stop talking. He fell again, harder this time. And the cold storage? Craddock asked, though he clearly suspected the answer. I thought, if it looked like an accident, like he'd gotten trapped, I managed to get him inside. He was still breathing, but unconscious. I locked the door and destroyed the emergency release mechanism from inside before pulling the door shut. I thought it would look like mechanical failure. The confession hung in the air, transforming Mrs. Fletcher from a supporting player to the principal actor in the tragedy. She had tried to protect her husband from the consequences of his actions, only to become a murderer herself. Chapter 6. The Truth About the Missing Pages. Inspector Craddock had established temporary headquarters in the village hall, transforming its usual setting of flower shows and parish meetings into a centre for criminal investigation. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows as Miss Marple, the Fletchers, and several other interested parties assembled for what Craddock had described as a reconstruction of the previous night's events. Mrs. Fletcher sat beside her husband, both under police guard, their faces bearing the exhausted appearance of those who had passed through crisis to resignation. James Fletcher had aged years in hours, his usual nervous energy replaced by stunned disbelief at his wife's confession. Before we proceed with charges, Craddock announced, there remain several puzzling aspects to this case that require clarification. Miss Marple had positioned herself where she could observe all participants, particularly a new arrival. Marcus Pennington, a London dealer in exotic fish who had been traced through the shipping labels on the smuggled packages. Pennington cut an incongruous figure in the village hall, his expensive suit and manicured appearance marking him as distinctly urban. He had arrived under police escort, his Busumkoven, initial resistance having given way to calculated cooperation when faced with evidence of his involvement in the smuggling operation. Mr. Pennington, Craddock began, you've admitted to being Whitmore's supplier of illegal exotic fish. How long had this arrangement been in place? 18 months, Pennington replied, his accent pure Belgravia despite his criminal associations. Albert Whitmore approached me at a trade show, said he had clients interested in rare species. No questions asked. Fletcher started at this revelation. That's when I became partner. Albert used my investment money to fund his smuggling operation. Among other things, Pennington confirmed with a slight smirk. Your partner was quite the entrepreneur. The fish shop provided perfect cover. Who suspects a village fishmonger of international smuggling? Miss Marple raised a gentle hand for attention. Mr. Pennington, you were at the shop last night, were you not? Pennington's composure slipped slightly. I delivered a special shipment as arranged. Albert had promised this would be our final transaction. He said he was getting out of the business. Why? Craddock demanded. His partner was getting suspicious. Albert feared discovery was imminent. He planned to make one last significant profit, then cease operations. Miss Marple produced the black ledger with its missing pages. These removed pages, I believe they contained records of your transactions. Pennington nodded reluctantly. Albert tore them out while I was there. Said he was destroying all evidence of our association. Burned them in the preparation room sink. What time was this? Craddock asked. I arrived at 11:30, left just after midnight. Albert was very much alive, though agitated. He kept saying someone was watching the shop, that he'd seen shadows moving outside. This timeline created a crucial gap. If Pennington left at midnight and Fletcher arrived shortly after, who had Albert seen watching the shop? Miss Marple turned her attention to the evidence table where the exotic fish packages lay sealed in evidence bags. Inspector, have you examined the preservation solution used for these specimens? Craddock consulted his notes. A specialized compound, quite expensive, requires careful temperature control. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. The sort that would force someone to use the cold storage room even for temporary storage. Mr. Whitmore couldn't leave such valuable specimens in the regular preparation area. She moved to the shop's floor plan spread across the table. The peculiar thing is the placement of that concealed panel. It required intimate knowledge of the cold storage room's construction, suggesting this wasn't Mr. Whitmore's first venture into concealment. Fletcher suddenly spoke up. Albert supervised the cold storage renovation personally 2 years ago, insisted on using a specific contractor from London, wouldn't let me oversee any of the work. Planning ahead, Craddock observed. He was establishing his smuggling operation even before bringing you in as partner. Mrs. Fletcher had remained silent throughout these revelations, but now she raised her head. None of this changes what I did, but I need to know, was Albert already dead when I put him in the cold storage? Dr. Haydock, who had been called to provide medical evidence, stepped forward. The head trauma was severe, Mrs. Fletcher. While he may have been breathing when you moved him, he would never have regained consciousness. The cold merely hastened the inevitable. This provided little comfort to Mrs. Fletcher, but Miss Marple sensed it was important for the woman to know the full truth of her actions. "There's one more matter," Miss Marple said, producing the single exotic fish scale she had retained from the crime scene. "This didn't come from the preserved specimens. It's fresh from a living fish." Pennington's expression shifted to genuine surprise. "Impossible. I only dealt in preserved specimens. Live transport is far too risky." "Then where did it come from?" Craddock asked. Miss Marple smiled slightly. "I believe if you check Mr. Whitmore's home, you'll find an aquarium containing exotic fish. He kept one specimen from each shipment, building a private collection. It was his secret passion, the real reason he entered the smuggling trade." Pennington laughed bitterly. "The fool! He risked everything for a fish collection?" "People have risked more for less," Miss Marple observed quietly. "Collectors often lose perspective on the value of their obsessions versus the cost of obtaining them." Craddock had been reviewing the evidence systematically, so Whitmore was smuggling exotic fish with Pennington. Fletcher discovered the operation, confronted his partner, and in the resulting struggle, Whitmore was injured. Mrs. Fletcher, attempting to protect her husband, transformed an accident into murder. "That appears to be the sequence of events," Miss Marple agreed, "though I suspect Mr. Whitmore's own paranoia contributed to his fate. Had he not threatened the Fletchers so severely, perhaps Mrs. Fletcher would have simply sought medical help." The inspector turned to the Fletchers. "James Fletcher, I'm charging you with assault. Constance Fletcher, you're charged with murder. You're both under arrest." As the couple was led away, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Albert Whitmore's greed had created a web that ultimately ensnared everyone it touched, including himself. Pennington, still under guard, spoke one final time. "The irony is, Whitmore had already made enough profit to retire comfortably, but he couldn't stop. He loved the thrill as much as the money." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "Greed is often its own punishment, Mr. Pennington, as you yourself may soon discover." Chapter 7. Revelations from the Freezer Inventory. The morning following. The arrests brought an unexpected development. Sergeant Pine arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just as she was finishing breakfast, his expression suggesting urgent news that couldn't wait for proper channels. "Miss Marple, Inspector Craddock requests your immediate presence at the shop. We've discovered something extraordinary in the inventory records." She found Craddock in the cold storage room, now fully illuminated by portable lights that revealed details previously hidden in shadow. The concealed panel had been completely removed, exposing a larger cavity than initially suspected. "Miss Marple," Craddock greeted her, "we've found a second ledger hidden behind the first compartment, but this one isn't Whitmore's." The ledger he showed her was newer, its entries in a different hand entirely. The writing was feminine, precise, with distinctive loops on the capital letters. "Mrs. Fletcher?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected otherwise. "We thought so initially, but the dates go back 5 years, long before the Fletchers arrived in Little Bentham." Craddock opened the ledger to reveal systematic records of transactions, all coded but clearly indicating regular shipments and payments. Miss Marple studied the entries carefully. "This predates Mr. Whitmore's smuggling operation. Someone else was using his cold storage facility before he discovered it himself. Or, Craddock suggested, someone taught him the business." They were interrupted by the arrival of Nurse Pemberton, who had worked at the village surgery for 30 years and knew everyone's medical history. She had been summoned to help identify a prescription found among the ledger's pages. "Oh my," Nurse Pemberton exclaimed upon seeing the prescription. "That's Mrs. Whitmore's sleeping medication. The poor dear suffered terrible insomnia before she passed." Miss Marple and Craddock exchanged glances. Mrs. Whitmore had died 3 years ago, supposedly of heart failure. "Nurse Pemberton," Miss Marple asked gently, "did Mrs. Whitmore have any unusual interests or hobbies?" The nurse considered this. "She loved tropical fish, actually. Had quite an impressive aquarium. Mr. Whitmore sold it after she died. Said it reminded him too much of her." The pieces were falling into place in an unexpected pattern. Miss Marple examined the ledger more closely, noting that entries ceased abruptly 3 years ago, coinciding with Mrs. Whitmore's death. "Inspector," she said, "I believe we've been looking at this case backwards. The smuggling operation didn't begin with Albert Whitmore, it began with his wife." Before Craddock could respond, Fletcher arrived, having been permitted to collect vital business documents under supervision. His face bore the haunted look of a man whose world had collapsed entirely. "Mr. Fletcher," Miss Marple addressed him, "you mentioned that Albert insisted on a specific contractor for the cold storage renovation. Do you recall the name?" Fletcher thought carefully. "Pemberton and Associates from London. Albert said they specialised in refrigeration systems." Nurse Pemberton gasped. "That's my nephew's company, but why would Mr. Whitmore? Oh dear." The connections were emerging rapidly now. Miss Marple turned to the nurse. "Your nephew, did he perhaps share his aunt's interest in tropical fish?" The elderly nurse sank into a chair. "He breeds them professionally now. Started as a hobby when he was young, visiting us here in the village." Her face had gone pale as the implications registered. Craddock was already reaching for his radio to request information about Pemberton and Associates. Within minutes, confirmation came through that the company had been investigated 2 years prior for suspected involvement in wildlife smuggling, though charges were never filed due to lack of evidence. "So, Mrs. Whitmore ran the original smuggling operation," Craddock summarised, using her nephew's construction company to create the concealed storage space. When she died, the operation ceased until Albert discovered the hidden compartment and decided to restart it himself. Miss Marple had moved to examine the freezer inventory sheets posted on the wall. They showed normal fish stock movements for the past year, but older sheets, yellowed with age, revealed discrepancies when compared with the hidden ledger. "Look at these dates," she indicated, large shipments of special orders that correspond exactly with entries in Mrs. Whitmore's ledger. She was running this operation under her husband's nose for years. Fletcher laughed bitterly. Albert always said his wife had a head for business, but preferred to stay in the background. Now we know why. The investigation was interrupted by the arrival of Timothy Pemberton himself, the nephew in question. A man in his 40s with the confident bearing of a successful businessman, he had come in response to his aunt's distressed telephone call. "Inspector," he said immediately, "I understand you've discovered my aunt's involvement in my late cousin's affairs." "Your cousin?" Craddock questioned. "Eleanor Whitmore was my mother's cousin. We were quite close, sharing our passion for exotic fish. When she asked my company to install specialised storage, I knew it wasn't entirely legitimate, but family is family." Miss Marple observed him carefully. "You helped her establish the smuggling operation?" "I provided the infrastructure," Pemberton admitted. "Eleanor handled the rest. She had connections through her aquarium society, collectors willing to pay premium prices for rare species." "And when she died," Craddock pressed, "the operation ended. I assumed Albert had discovered and destroyed everything. Imagine my surprise when Pennington contacted me last year, saying Albert Whitmore wanted to resume shipments." This revelation cast new light on recent events. Albert Whitmore hadn't just discovered the concealed storage, he had discovered his late wife's entire secret life. "That must have been quite a shock," Miss Marple observed sympathetically, "learning that one's spouse had conducted a criminal enterprise for years without detection." Pemberton nodded. "When Albert contacted me, he was bitter, angry. Said if Eleanor could profit from crime while maintaining her respectable facade, he deserved the same opportunity. But he lacked Eleanor's subtlety. She never got greedy." The irony was palpable. Albert Whitmore had attempted to follow his wife's footsteps, only to fall victim to the very greed she had avoided. "One thing puzzles me," Miss Marple said. "How did Mrs. Whitmore die? It seems rather convenient, her passing just as the authorities were investigating the wildlife smuggling." Nurse Pemberton shifted uncomfortably. "She had a weak heart, everyone knew that. The death certificate was quite clear." "Still," Miss Marple persisted gently, "the timing is curious." Timothy Pemberton's expression hardened. If you're suggesting something untoward, Miss Marple, I should remind you that Eleanor's death was thoroughly investigated. Natural causes, the coroner confirmed it. Yet something in his manner suggested relief that his cousin could no longer be questioned about her activities. Miss Marple filed this observation away, though she suspected this particular mystery would remain unsolved. Chapter 8. The Partner Who Knew Too Much. The revelations about Mrs. Whitmore's criminal enterprise had transformed the investigation's focus entirely. Inspector Craddock had obtained a warrant to search the Whitmore family home, a modest Victorian house on Church Lane that Albert had maintained as a shrine to his late wife's memory. Miss Marple accompanied the inspector, her presence now accepted as invaluable to understanding the complex web of relationships and secrets that had culminated in murder. The house felt frozen in time, with Eleanor Whitmore's belongings still arranged as though she might return at any moment. "He never recovered from her death," observed Mrs. Harrison, the daily help who had agreed to provide access. "Kept everything exactly as she left it, even her reading glasses on the side table." The aquarium room, a converted conservatory at the rear of the house, provided the most striking evidence of Eleanor's true passion. Though the tank stood empty, the elaborate filtration systems and temperature controls revealed professional-level equipment far beyond a casual hobbyist's needs. "This must have cost thousands," Craddock noted, examining the sophisticated setup. Miss Marple studied the bookshelves lining one wall, filled with volumes on marine biology, fish breeding, and international trade regulations. Several books had bookmarks protruding, and she carefully examined these marked pages. "How interesting," she murmured. "These marked sections all relate to legal loopholes in wildlife import laws." Mrs. Whitmore was quite the scholar of regulatory weakness. Among Eleanor's papers, they discovered correspondence with collectors worldwide, all carefully coded but clearly indicating a network of illegal trade. More disturbing were letters from someone identified only as J.F. "James Fletcher?" Craddock suggested. Miss Marple shook her head. "The dates precede Mr. Fletcher's arrival in the village, but observe the handwriting on these envelopes. It matches entries in the shop's old delivery logs." She produced a sample for comparison, revealing the truth. J.F. was John Fairweather, the shop's previous assistant, who had left abruptly 5 years ago, shortly before Eleanor's death. "We need to find Fairweather," Craddock declared, but Mrs. Harrison interrupted. "Oh, you won't find John far. He manages the fishing supply store in Greater Bentham now. Comes through the village regular-like, checking on his elderly mother." Within an hour, John Fairweather sat in the village hall, a weathered man in his 50s whose calloused hands spoke of honest work. Yet his expression suggested someone carrying long-held secrets. "I knew this day would come," he began without preamble. "When I heard about Albert's death, I knew the truth would surface eventually." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "You were Eleanor Whitmore's partner in the smuggling operation." "Partner is too strong a word. I was her employee, both at the shop and in her side business. She paid well for silence and assistance." "Tell us everything," Craddock commanded. Fairweather's story unveiled another layer of deception. Eleanor had recruited him after discovering his own minor theft from the shop, using blackmail to ensure cooperation. He had helped manage shipments, maintain records, and ensure Albert remained ignorant of his wife's activities. She was brilliant at deception, Fairweather admitted. Albert thought her frequent trips were for aquarium society meetings. In reality, she was coordinating shipments, meeting suppliers. "What happened 5 years ago?" Miss Marple inquired. Fairweather's expression darkened. "Eleanor was getting reckless, taking bigger risks. I warned her the authorities were getting suspicious, but she wouldn't listen. Said she had protection, someone in law enforcement who would warn her of investigations." This was new information that made Craddock stiffen. She had a corrupt contact? "Never knew who. She just said we were safe, that her insurance policy would protect us. Then she died suddenly, and I took it as a sign to get out." Miss Marple had been examining dates in Eleanor's ledger. "Mr. Fairweather, the last entry in Eleanor's records is dated 3 days before her death. It mentions a final payment to insurance. Do you know what this meant?" Fairweather shook his head, but his expression suggested otherwise. Under continued questioning, he finally admitted, "She was being blackmailed herself. Someone had discovered her operation and demanded payments for silence. She, Never told me who. The investigation had taken another unexpected turn. Eleanor Whitmore, the master manipulator, had herself fallen victim to extortion. Could Albert have discovered her secret, Craddock suggested? Perhaps confronted her, leading to a heart attack? Miss Marple considered this. The timing suggests otherwise. If Albert had known 3 years ago, why wait until now to start his own operation? She turned to Fairweather. You've been watching the shop, haven't you? You knew Albert had discovered the concealed storage. Fairweather nodded reluctantly. My mother lives across from the shop. I saw unusual deliveries, recognized Pennington from the old days. I knew Albert was following Eleanor's path. Did you warn him? Craddock asked. I tried, subtly. Left anonymous notes warning him to stop. But Albert was stubborn, thought he was smarter than Eleanor. Miss Marple had noticed something in Fairweather's jacket pocket, a prescription bottle. Mr. Fairweather, might I see your medication? He produced the bottle reluctantly. It contained sleeping pills, the same type found near Eleanor's body when she died. You were with Eleanor the night she died, weren't you? Miss Marple said gently. Fairweather broke down completely. She asked me to come to the house, said she was ending everything, destroying all evidence. She'd taken the sleeping pills, said she couldn't face exposure and disgrace. I stayed with her until the end. Suicide? Craddock asked, skeptically. She said someone was closing in, someone who knew everything. She chose her own exit rather than face prison and shame. Miss Marple studied the prescription bottle more carefully. These pills were prescribed by Dr. Haydock, but the label has been altered. The dosage has been changed from 1 pill to 3. The implication was clear. Eleanor might not have committed suicide. Someone had tricked her into taking a fatal dose. Who had access to her medication? Craddock demanded. Only Eleanor and Albert, Fairweather replied. She kept them in her bedside drawer. The possibility that Albert might have murdered his wife for her crimes, then later adopted those same crimes himself, created a moral complexity that silenced everyone present. Had Albert been a vigilante who became the very thing he had destroyed? Miss Marple sensed they were approaching the truth, but crucial pieces remained missing. The identity of Eleanor's blackmailer, the extent of Albert's knowledge before his wife's death, and the ultimate catalyst for recent events all required further investigation. Chapter 9. The Blackmailer's Final Account. The investigation had reached a critical juncture when an unexpected visitor arrived at the police station. Samuel Morrison, the recently retired bank manager, appeared deeply troubled as he requested a private audience with Inspector Craddock and Miss Marple. I've been wrestling with my conscience, Morrison began, his dignified bearing compromised by obvious distress. Professional confidentiality has prevented me from speaking until now, but given the circumstances, I feel obligated to share information about Albert Whitmore's financial affairs. In the privacy of Craddock's temporary office, Morrison produced a folder of bank records spanning several years. 3 years ago, Albert began making regular, large cash deposits, always just below the reporting threshold. When I questioned him, he claimed they were from selling his wife's jewellery and collectibles after her death. Miss Marple examined the records carefully. These deposits begin exactly 1 month after Eleanor's death and continue monthly until 6 weeks ago. When they stopped abruptly, Morrison confirmed, Albert came to me in considerable distress, seeking a substantial loan. When I pressed for reasons, he admitted someone had been blackmailing him. Craddock leaned forward intently. Blackmail? Did he say who or why? He refused to elaborate, just said it was a private matter relating to his late wife. I assumed perhaps Eleanor had conducted an affair, something that might damage her memory. Miss Marple had noticed something significant in the deposit patterns. Mr. Morrison, these amounts match exactly the mysterious payments recorded in Eleanor's ledger as insurance. The blackmailer simply transferred his attention from wife to husband. The implications were staggering. The same person who had extorted Eleanor had continued bleeding Albert after her death, suggesting intimate knowledge of both their crimes. Morrison had more to reveal. Last week, Albert came to me privately. He said he'd discovered the blackmailer's identity and intended to confront them. He seemed triumphant, said he'd found proof that would turn the tables entirely. What kind of proof? Craddock pressed. Documents, he said. Papers that would expose the blackmailer's own criminal activities. He'd hidden them somewhere safe, planning to use them as leverage. Miss Marple stood suddenly. "Inspector, we must return to the cold storage room immediately. I believe I know where Albert hid those documents." Back at the shop, Miss Marple directed their attention to a section of the cold storage room they'd overlooked, the ceiling panels. Sure enough, one panel had been recently disturbed. Behind it, wrapped in waterproof plastic, lay a collection of documents that would transform their understanding of the case. The papers revealed that Dr. Marcus Haydock, the village's respected physician, had been prescribing controlled substances illegally for years, selling them to addicts in neighbouring towns. Eleanor Whitmore had discovered this when she noticed discrepancies in prescription patterns during her own illegal activities. "My word," Craddock breathed. "Dr. Haydock was the blackmailer?" Miss Marple nodded gravely. Both women had discovered each other's crimes, creating mutual leverage. But when Eleanor decided to end her operation, Haydock couldn't afford to lose his income source. He manipulated her medication, causing the overdose that killed her. The documents included Eleanor's own investigation notes, meticulously documenting Haydock's illegal prescriptions with dates, patients, and amounts. She had been building a case for self-protection. After Eleanor's death, Miss Marple continued, Haydock transferred his demands to Albert, claiming to know about Eleanor's smuggling. Albert paid to protect his wife's reputation, never knowing he was paying his wife's murderer. Fletcher, who had been permitted to attend this revelation, spoke up. But Albert discovered the truth? Recently, yes. When he started his own smuggling operation, he gained access to Eleanor's hidden records and found her documentation about Haydock. He planned to confront the doctor, end the blackmail permanently. Craddock was already radioing for units to arrest Dr. Haydock, but word came back that the doctor had fled. His surgery was abandoned, his home empty. A search revealed he'd been planning his escape for days, suggesting he knew Albert's death would lead to exposure. He must have been watching the shop that night, Miss Marple reasoned. When he saw the confrontation between the Fletchers and Albert, he saw an opportunity. After Mrs. Fletcher left Albert in the cold storage, Haydock ensured the door remained locked and disabled the emergency release. Making Mrs. Fletcher believe she'd committed murder when Haydock delivered the fatal imprisonment, Craddock concluded. Mrs. Fletcher, brought from her cell to hear this revelation, collapsed in tears. "You mean I didn't—" "Albert might have survived if not for Haydock's intervention." "The head injury was severe," Miss Marple said gently, "but not necessarily fatal. Haydock ensured Albert would never expose his crimes." The search for Dr. Haydock intensified, but he had vanished with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this possibility. His bank accounts had been emptied gradually over weeks. His car found abandoned at the railway station. Among his abandoned papers they found one final revelation, a letter to Albert, dated the day before his death. "You think you've won, but you're as guilty as I am. Your wife was a criminal, and now so are you. Expose me, and I'll ensure everyone knows the truth about the respectable Whitmores." The letter was unsigned, but in Haydock's distinctive handwriting. It had been the final trigger that sent Albert to his fatal confrontation at the shop. Timothy Pemberton, Eleanor's nephew, had remained to hear these revelations. "Poor Eleanor," he said quietly. "She thought she was so clever, but she was trapped between her own crimes and Haydock's manipulation." "A web of mutual destruction," Miss Marple observed sadly, "each person holding secrets over others until the structure collapsed under its own weight." The investigation had revealed a community riddled with deception. The respected doctor dealing drugs, the proper fishmonger's wife smuggling wildlife, the nervous partner with gambling debts, and ultimately, ordinary people driven to extraordinary crimes. As evening fell over Little Bentham, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic sequence of events. 3 lives lost, several others destroyed, all stemming from greed and the desperate desire to maintain respectability while profiting from crime. "Will we find Haydock?" Craddock asked her quietly. "Perhaps," she replied. "But the greater tragedy is how long he operated undetected, protected by his position and reputation. How many other Dr. Haydocks exist in seemingly respectable communities?" It was a sobering thought that cast shadows over the village as the investigation moved toward its conclusion. Chapter 10. Justice Served Cold. The village hall was packed for what had been advertised as a community meeting to address recent events. Inspector Craddock had insisted on this public resolution, believing the village deserved to understand the complex web of crimes that had been operating beneath their peaceful surface for years. Miss Marple sat in her usual position, observing the assembled faces with interest. The shocking revelations about Dr. Haydock had shaken the community profoundly. Many present had been his patients for decades, trusting him with their most intimate health concerns. Craddock stood at the front, his manner formal but compassionate. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to provide a complete account of our investigation into Albert Whitmore's death and the criminal activities it has exposed." He began with Eleanor Whitmore's smuggling operation, revealing how the respectable fishmonger's wife had built a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The audience listened in stunned silence as he detailed the concealed storage, the international connections, and the substantial profits. "Mrs. Whitmore's activities might have remained hidden indefinitely," Craddock continued, "but for her discovery of Dr. Haydock's illegal prescription scheme. This created a deadly balance of mutual blackmail that ultimately destroyed them both." Miss Marple watched the crowd's reactions carefully. Several people who had been close to the Whitmores appeared genuinely shocked, while others nodded as though pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Craddock then revealed Haydock's murder of Eleanor through medication tampering, his subsequent blackmail of Albert, and his role in ensuring Albert's death in the cold storage room. The village doctor, trusted by all, had been the most dangerous criminal among them. "As of this morning," Craddock announced, "Dr. Marcus Haydock has been apprehended at Dover, attempting to board a ferry to France. He was carrying false documentation and a significant amount of cash." A collective gasp rose from the audience. Justice would be served, though the betrayal of trust would take much longer to heal. "What about the Fletchers?" someone called out. Craddock's expression softened slightly. "James Fletcher has been charged with assault and will likely receive a suspended sentence given the circumstances. Constance Fletcher's charge has been reduced to manslaughter, as evidence shows she believed Albert was already dying when she acted." Miss Marple rose to address the gathering. "What we've uncovered here is not unique to Little Bentham. It's a reminder that crime can flourish anywhere when good people look away or fail to question irregularities." She paused, ensuring she had everyone's attention. Eleanor Whitmore's exotic fish shipments were noticed by several people who dismissed their suspicions. Dr. Haydock's unusual prescription patterns were observed but never reported. Albert's recent behavioral changes were apparent to many. "Are you saying we're partly responsible?" Mrs. Pemberton asked defensively. "I'm saying," Miss Marple replied gently, "that communities thrive on trust but survive through appropriate vigilance. The line between privacy and dangerous secrecy is one we must all learn to recognize." Timothy Pemberton stood to speak. "My cousin Eleanor was wrong to do what she did, but she was also a victim. Haydock exploited her fear of exposure to murder her. How many others might he have harmed that we don't know about?" This question would haunt the village for months to come. An investigation into Haydock's medical practice revealed dozens of suspicious deaths over the years, particularly among elderly patients with valuable estates. The full extent of his crimes might never be known. John Fairweather also addressed the gathering. "I knew about Eleanor's smuggling and said nothing. I was complicit through silence. If I'd spoken up 5 years ago, perhaps Albert would still be alive." His confession encouraged others to share their own suspicions and observations, creating a cathartic moment of communal acknowledgement. The village had been living with hidden crimes for so long that exposure brought both pain and relief. As the meeting concluded, Marcus Pennington, the London exotic fish dealer, was brought in to face charges. His testimony would prove crucial in dismantling the wider smuggling network that Eleanor had helped establish. "Whitmore was an amateur," Pennington said dismissively. "His wife, though she was professional, knew exactly how to move product without attracting attention. If she hadn't crossed Haydock, she'd probably still be operating." The final revelation came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Harrison, the Whitmore's daily help, approached Miss Marple privately after the meeting. "I have something that might interest you," she said, producing a letter from her handbag. "Mrs. Whitmore gave this to me the day before she died, said to open it only if something happened to her." The letter, in Eleanor's neat handwriting, read, "If you're reading this, then Dr. Haydock has finally acted on his threats. I've discovered he's been murdering patients for years, making deaths appear natural while benefiting from their estates. I have proof hidden in my aquarium room behind the filter housing of the largest tank. Please ensure justice is served. Eleanor Whitmore." This final piece of evidence would ensure Haydock faced multiple murder charges. Eleanor, even in anticipating her death, had prepared one last revelation. Miss Marple reflected on the case as she walked home through the village streets. The frozen fish that had first aroused her suspicions had indeed hidden dark secrets, but not just of smuggling. They had concealed a web of murder, blackmail, and betrayal that had infected the community for years. The fishmonger's shop would never reopen. The building stood as a reminder of how ordinary facades could hide extraordinary crimes. But perhaps, Miss Marple thought, that was a lesson Little Bentham needed to learn. Evil didn't always come from outside. Sometimes it grew in the most familiar places, nurtured by silence and respectability. As she reached her cottage, she paused to look back at the village, now quiet under the evening stars. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of healing, but tonight the truth had been served as cold and harsh as the freezer that had claimed Albert Whitmore's life. Justice, like revenge, was indeed a dish best served cold. Dear listeners, our tale concludes here, but I hope it serves as a reminder that the most mundane places can harbour the darkest secrets. Thank you for joining me tonight on Velvet Clues. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your instincts sharp. Good night.